In our final clip for this module, I want to then bring us to the logical conclusion to each of the themes as we have gone through them. That as we've gone through each theme, we've seen that each theme really connects with the other, and it gives us a broadening of understanding of the themes of the New Testament. The final theme that I want to deal with today is called the mission of God. The mission of God. Now, of course, the word mission doesn't appear within the New Testament. And of course, the reason for that is the mission, or the word mission, actually isn't Greek at all. It's Latin. It comes from the Latin word. And the Latin word is missio. Missio. And so mission of God, if we write it in Latin, would be the missio Dei. The missio Dei, the mission of God. And as we've moved into the postmodern era, as we've moved into the era post the 1950s, what we've seen is a beginning of a shift within Christianity. And the beginning shift of Christianity is a shift away from John's gospel, a shift away from, in fact, even Paul's writings. Paul's writings, which were particularly connected with salvation by grace and so on, those things that were part of the Reformation. The Reformation was very much a rethink of how we understand salvation, of how we understand the concept of what Jesus came to do, the mission of God through Jesus. And in fact, what came out of the Reformation was very much a sense of saying that it's not about what we do. It's about what God has done and about what Jesus did on the cross that actually is what salvation's about. And we see that reformational theology is really what's been part of the Protestant church for the last 400 years. But as we move into the 1950s or post-1950s, post the time of the Second World War and the First World War, and the impact that the First and Second World War had on Christianity, we see that there's been a change in the way in which Christianity is approaching itself. That instead of being in that focus on heaven, that focus on what's going to happen after we die, the focus has moved to more about what's happening here on earth. And in many ways, what that has been a change of focus in the New Testament back to the Synoptic Gospels, back to the Gospels particularly like Luke, where Luke talks to us about not blessed are the poor in spirit, but blessed are the poor. That when Luke talks about the poor, when he talks about those who are thirsty, he's not talking about those who are spiritually poor or spiritually thirsty or spiritually hungry. He's talking about those who are actually poor and actually hungry and actually thirsty. In fact, what we see within Luke's gospel is very much a social gospel. Very much a sense of saying that if we're going to be Christians, then it's no use just saying love, 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 as if somehow all that just saying it is enough. When we look at Matthew's gospel, we realize that the last judgment will be between the sheep and the goats. And the image that Jesus brings, that parable of the last judgment in the sheep and the goats, that they will be separated, that the goats would be put on God's left hand and the sheep on God's right hand. And the difference between them, the thing that made them sheep versus made them goats, was not whether they had good theology or whether they were Presbyterians or Methodists or Uniting, but rather the thing that made them to be different was who out of them had actually unconsciously helped the least, helped those who were most in need, actually made a difference to the world in which they were living. That was the key for Matthew. And when Matthew tells us to go and make disciples, he doesn't say go out and make converts, go and make followers, go and make an army. He says go out and make disciples. Disciples, learners. Those who would then do all that I have commanded you. And in Matthew's gospel, there's no doubt that what Jesus has commanded us was not just to have good theology, but in fact what he commanded us to do was to go and feed the hungry and look after the sick and give water to those who are thirsty. That's what he was encouraging people to do. And so when we come back to it, we realize that as we've now thought through the concept of the mission of God, We've now moved away from that purely individualistic thing that the mission of God was to save my soul so that I can be saved from hell and be allowed to spend eternity with Him in heaven. What we realize is that the reason for the church to exist is to be that which can execute the mission of God. And what we've moved in terms of this postmodern time is we've moved from an individualistic, conversion-based understanding of that mission to one which I believe is closer to what the New Testament was trying to tell us. In fact, I believe it's closer to what the Bible was trying to tell us. That the mission of God is to bring healing, is to bring restoration of relationship, is to restore people to what they were intended to be. That was the mission of God. That is the mission of God. And that's the mission that we need to seek to fulfill. I don't think that Paul didn't talk about that. I think that he did. But unfortunately, what we did in the theologians is we concentrated on the first half of the letters instead of also balancing that with the second half. It's no use just being saved by grace unless we also then live out that grace in the way in which we seek to save others. I think if we look at the book of James, if we look at the book of Revelation, there's no question in my mind at all that each of those books were reminding us not only to be saved by grace, but then in grace and in mercy and in love through the action of the body of Christ to go out and be grace and mercy and forgiveness to others. The mission of God, therefore, is a social mission. And therefore, the church needs to be involved in the social mission of the world as well. It's no use for the church to be so heavenly aware that it is no earthly good. The church needs to be involved here on earth. The church needs to be an agent of change, an agent of transformation through the action of the incarnate Jesus. When we look at all these themes together, we realize that they all hang together. The reason why Jesus comes is to redeem humanity. The mission of God, then, is for us to continue that mission. We are to go out into the world, to love it, and to care for it the way God has cared for us.